We can't go on living like this. This phrase, which Mikhail Gorbachev whispered to the new Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze, may sum up the philosophy that dictated the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party and the first and last president of the vast multinational, multilingual, and dilemmas union. Gorbachev was not naive, as President Vladimir Putin accused him, nor was he ignorant of the world's facts, according to press analyses. Rather, he was aware that the reform of the Soviet Union might end with the departure of the Communist Party he leads from power and the advent of new forces in the Kremlin. His hesitation and reluctance to resort to force in settling disputes with his comrades, although he was not quite as peaceful in the face of protest movements in the turbulent republics of Georgia, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and the Baltic Basin, and his adherence to the official discourse of power that denies what is happening behind closed doors in favor of he painted a rosy and optimistic picture of events, all of which gave the impression that he launched a process beyond his ability to control the course of things. It can be asserted that Mikhail Gorbachev understood the difficulty of what his country, the Soviet Union, at that time, was facing, and its failure to perform the role it assigned itself, starting in the 50s, by telling all allies and friends of the need to rely on themselves and not wait for Soviet help. He said these words to the leaders of Czechoslovakia, Gustav Husak, and East Germany, Erich Honecker, as well as to Fidel Castro and Hafez al-Assad. Each of these reacted differently. Eastern European leaders participating in the Warsaw Pact did not believe that the Soviet Union would abandon them if their security line was disturbed. Their strategic position vis-à-vis the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the deployment of huge Soviet forces in their country gave justification to believe that the Soviet comrades would undoubtedly intervene if a danger emerged to the Eastern European communist governments. These owed a lot to the Soviet Union, who practically created them, protected them, and oversaw their assumption of power in the years following World War II. Only Poland knew that the wave was beyond the capabilities of the ruling communist parties to overcome it. The Polish communists, facing movements ranging from union demands to a radical rejection of communist rule since the Solidarity strikes in 1980 and the imposition of military rule to avoid a Soviet-style invasion in Hungary and Czechoslovakia in 1956–68, were the first to hand over power to a democratically elected government in 1989. Cuban exception. Cuban leader Castro did not feel he owed his position to the Soviets. The revolution he led in the late 50s was victorious by the efforts of Cuban militants, and some internationalists such as Ecobedo Che Guevara. Thus, the power in Havana is a purely national product, although it meets with the Soviets in anti-imperialism and in the struggle against the United States. Likewise, the Cubans chose socialism of their own free will, not to curry favor with the Soviets or others. Thus expressed Castro in a long and angry speech he gave on the occasion of the return of Cuban forces from the war in Angola. With ore on the shield, Castro said, recalling the words of the Spartan mothers as they bid farewell to their children on their way to war. And just as Cuban soldiers returned from Angola with ore on a shield, that is, carrying their shields or being carried as corpses after their death fighting enemies, so Cuba will fight for its choice. Socialism or death, Castro sealed with the slogan that remained raised on the island many years after the disappearance of the Soviet Union. As for Syrian President Hafez al-Assad, it is said that he returned from a visit to Moscow in 1987 with the conviction that Gorbachev, despite his promises to continue providing Syria with military equipment and economic assistance, began to withdraw from the Middle East and would not continue the policy of his predecessors in supporting Syrian policies in the region, and that the Soviets had new views of the need for a negotiated peace with Israel. There are those who believe that this visit paved the way for the improvement of Syrian relations with the United States, leading to Damascus' participation in the international coalition to expel the Iraqi occupation from Kuwait. Easing the burden of international issues was based on an assessment conducted by Gorbachev and his team that included a comparison between what the commitment to the pursuit of imperialism imposes in the world and what the Soviet Union derives from its international obligations. The facts of the decline in agricultural production and the inadequacy of oil and gas exports to meet the growing needs, especially after the United States launched the Strategic Defense Initiative known as Star Wars, which was originally designed to exhaust the Soviet Union and absorb its resources in an arms race in which it is unable to match the West. Clarity so that it is not hidden from any official in the Kremlin. In addition, the sanctions imposed by the West after the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and the war of attrition in which it was involved there, are among the issues that weighed heavily on Gorbachev's leadership. The conviction of socialism. On the other hand, Gorbachev did not abandon his belief in the superiority of the socialist system in securing social stability and peace between the very different Soviet national and religious components. He remained convinced that the union of socialist republics was the appropriate framework for the relationship between the different nationalities, even after the successive republics declared their sovereignty in a manner similar to separation from the Soviet Union, which 80% of its citizens expressed their desire to preserve in a referendum held in March 1991. By 1990, the process that Gorbachev had launched 5 years earlier had reached an impasse. The Soviet Union has become a body devoid of members that began declaring their independence, secession, and sovereignty. It seemed as if each of the 15 Soviet republics embarked on its own history, including its own civil wars, border conflicts with its neighbors, foreign alliances, and economic programs. This body continued to search for a role until the August 19, 1991, coup d'état occurred, led by the State Emergency Committee, which announced its assumption of power due to an illness that struck Gorbachev while he was on vacation in the resort of Sochi. The coup, which was thwarted by the Russian citizens taking to the streets of Moscow, led by the President of the Russian Federation and Gorbachev's stubborn opponent, Boris Yeltsin, practically ended the chances of saving the Soviet Union after it appeared that the party, military, and security elite would not abandon their old methods, and were ready to use violence and murder, even against the President of the Union. Soviet Union to stay in power. The intransigence of the old elite and its refusal to reform, despite everything that the country had witnessed in previous years, was a major factor in the end of the Gorbachev era, who declared on December 26, 1991 the end of the Soviet Union as a state. He himself was determined 6 years ago to save and revive it. After that date, Gorbachev became a figure from the past. The West honors him in the most venerable terms, and its citizens accuse him of causing the deterioration of their living conditions, leading to responsibility for the stifling crisis of the 90s. There is no doubt that the man will remain in this ambiguous position, between sanctification and demonization, which he did not choose voluntarily, but was pushed into him by the mighty force of history. Yeltsin, and Yakovlev. The most famous opponent of Mikhail Gorbachev was, without a doubt, Boris Yeltsin. The official of the Sverdlovsk region, currently Ekaterinburg, in the Soviet Communist Party, who was brought by Gorbachev to take charge of the party in the capital, Moscow, as part of the first batch of position changes made by the new Secretary General upon taking office in 1985. Gorbachev believed that the dynamic and reformist Yeltsin would support him in the sensitive position at the head of the party in Moscow after he succeeded in removing his rival for the secretariat, the hardline and traditional former party official in the capital, Viktor Grushin. It seems that Gorbachev's assumptions were misplaced and Yeltsin became at the forefront of opponents from the reformist side who demand faster and deeper changes in the party and the state. A major reform movement, such as that launched by General Secretary Gorbachev, could only divide the Soviet Communists between supporters and opponents. In a structure that lacked the mechanisms of democratic change such as the Soviet Party, the opposition took the form of conspiracies in closed rooms and blocks among like-minded people. Opposition culminated in the August 19, 1991 coup, which practically eliminated the last chance to save the Soviet Union as a state. As for loyalty, and if we put aside that which stands by the owner of any authority in every place and time in the hope of privileges, positions, protection, and prestige, it was not coherent, neither politically nor intellectually. Alexander Yakovlev, an intellectual and familiar with Western culture, served as the ideological reference for Gorbachev and for the process of reconstruction and transparency, Perestroika and glasnost. He is credited with the idea of abandoning traditional Soviet communism and engaging in building socialism with a human face, or moral socialism without neglecting the possibility of the Soviet Union disintegrating and losing its military might and global standing. The irony here is that socialism with a human face was a slogan raised by the Czechoslovak communists led by Alexander Dubček in what was known as the Prague Spring, which ended under the tracks of Soviet tanks in the summer of 1968. Yakovlev's path towards the Politburo, the pinnacle of power at that time, was not exceptional, as he got involved in the party core early. But he devoted a great deal of time to studying the theoretical foundations of Marxist-Leninist philosophy and its origins in German thought. There are those who say that his intellectual tour ended with him adopting views rejecting all the main Marxist statements as inapplicable without twisting the arm of human society and resorting to repression and coercion that he personally experienced through the reduction of his party rank after criticizing the rise of Russian nationalism in the party. Yakovlev's views and their impact on Gorbachev quickly drew the attention of the party's hawks, who addressed the man with slander and by recalling his Jewish origins, which since the time of Joseph Stalin turned into an insult that must be hidden, after reviving the deep anti-Semitic traditions in Russian history. Indeed, Yakovlev is credited with the idea of using the mechanisms of the totalitarian regime to dismantle the totalitarian regime, meaning that a reformist leadership resorted to the method of command and prohibition to impose a kind of democratic transformation within the party. And Shevardnadze's thoughts? Eduard Shevardnadze, who, like Gorbachev, came to Moscow from afar, was the foreign arm of the reforms project. Except for the desire to change the shabby situation, Shevardnadze's background was markedly different from that which produced the Secretary General. This Georgian man, whose local accent did not disappear when he spoke Russian, was an official in the Georgian Ministry of the Interior, and in this capacity he oversaw the anti-corruption campaigns, what qualified him to assume the leadership of the party in the Republic. Hence his reputation as a reformer, and he was counted among the team surrounding Gorbachev. In contrast to Yeltsin, the opponent from the reformist side, appeared Igor Legachev, the conservative, who moved from supporting Gorbachev and organizing his campaign to reach the General Secretariat after the death of Yuri Andropov, and then Konstantin Chernenko in 1983 and 1985, came to confront the reforms of his former ally. Things could not stop at the fight against rampant corruption among high-ranking party officials and the change of leaders of the off-center Soviet republics. However, Legachev distanced himself from open hostility to Gorbachev. The same position was taken by Anatoly Lukyanov, Gorbachev's friend, and former colleague at the law faculty of Moscow University and then one of his opponents, who warned that his friend's policies would lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the hostility to Gorbachev within the party included former allies such as his deputy, Gennady Yanayev, and his comrades, who joined the State Emergency Committee that organized the coup against Gorbachev and failed to lead it in a comic/tragic failure. Years of perestroika in the eyes of an Arab student. I arrived in the Soviet Union for the first time in September 1985, about 6 months after Mikhail Gorbachev took over the General Secretariat of the Communist Party. She left it for the last time in the spring of 1990, at the height of the changes in Eastern Europe. Thus, I spent the greater part of the term of the first and last Soviet president as a student in the Soviet Union, in its cultural capital and the cradle of its Leningrad Revolution, St. Petersburg, before the Bolshevik Revolution and after the Soviet collapse. The car that took us from Beirut, whose airport is closed, to Damascus, and we were 3 students, left at night through what was the roads of dignity so that we could reach the airport in the Syrian capital in the morning and catch the Russian plane heading to Moscow. The aforementioned road was created as an alternative to the Beirut-Damascus road, which was controlled by the Lebanese army, with the aim of supplying the southern suburbs and the western part of the capital with ammunition and weapons during the Dahiyat uprising and the February 6 uprising and the exit of the western part of Beirut from the control of the authority that it was led by President Amin Gemayel. The dark road illuminated by sniper bullets from the positions of the 8th Brigade in the Lebanese army, loyal to Gemayel, and the potholes that make the passage akin to jumping on a rubber swing, were all in contrast to the wide paths that lead to the Beirut parking lot that receives cars coming from Lebanon. While the cleanliness and arrangement of the wide roads that lead to Damascus International Airport, it looked like a scene from a movie compared to the destruction and ruins that shroud the Lebanese cities, especially the capital after 7 years of wars and fighting. A huge Il-86 plane carried us from Damascus with a short layover in Larnaca, then to Moscow, where we were surprised by cold and rainy weather in early September. The breadth of the Damascus airport road seemed very modest in front of the highways that connect Sheremetyevo to airport, which was built by Italian companies to receive the participants in the Moscow Olympics in 1985, in the heart of the Soviet capital, at the time. From the hotel for incoming foreign students, the first signs of Gorbachev's reforms were visible. That is because long lines of citizens stand in front of small stores. Older students, who were visiting the hotel to greet their relatives or to meet and help new students, explained that those standing were waiting to get 2 bottles of vodka, the famous Russian alcoholic drink that was among the goals of Gorbachev's first reforms. The new Secretary General, under the influence of his predecessor, separated by Konstantin Chernenko, Yuri Andropov, who had a significant impact on Gorbachev's rise to leadership positions in the Communist Party, and also reportedly under the influence of his powerful wife Raisa Gorbacheva, expressed his dissatisfaction with the effects of alcoholism on Soviet society and its impact on production, discipline, and effectiveness in all areas. Older students were assuring that reforms would be launched after the 27th Party Congress, which was held in March 1986. Indeed, Gorbachev removed a number of his former rivals and opponents and brought in allies and loyalists. But barely a month or more after the conference, the Chernobyl nuclear reactor exploded, which had contradictory effects on the internal policy of the new Secretary General. Of course, we only knew about the explosion when the official media reported it a few days later and downplayed it. In the following years things started to accelerate. We have been waiting for Gorbachev's speeches with the Soviet citizens to find out how the country